at a given level in order to provide rising living standards and sufficient jobs to maintain the legitimacy of the party and the government. That's my third reason why I think they are reformist. My fourth point is that, and this is where I agree with the negative commentary provided, is it Gary, by the way? Gordon, in his first speech, in his first presentation, which was, I agree with him entirely. The internal commentary in Beijing now does refer to 10 wasted years of reform. They talk about this period of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao as 10 wasted years. I offer no view as to whether that is accurate or not, but I do reflect a view commonly in circulation in policy and political elites within Beijing that that is the case. And if you go to substantive elements of economic reform in that 10-year period, it's difficult to quantify. The architects, the two architects of China's economic reform program have been one, Deng Xiaoping, and two, Zhu Rongji. But Zhu Rongji has been retired for quite a while now. Therefore, they know that they have to continue the reform program as articulated in the 12th five-year plan if they're going to produce the economic dividends they need. Second last point. So what is going to happen in terms of the content of this reform program? Well, again, I agree with Gordon on this. There has been quite formidable flight of private capital out of China. Everybody knows that, outside the country and inside the country. And there's a specific reason for that, is that private firms in particular felt correctly that they were being squeezed out of the market for two specific reasons. One, non-competitive supply of price for financial capital for their firms to expand because of differential lending regimes between state-owned banks and SOEs on the one hand and the financial sector to private firms on the other. And the second is simply the volume of SOE activity in crowding out the market for other competitors. The Chinese government knows that. Therefore, the first reform I believe that you will see, based on my discussions in Beijing, will be financial sector reforms to close the gap and to eliminate the gap in terms of the price of capital provided to all firms in the economy, state or non-state. The second one I think they will do, and this is a bigger call, will be to find some lower level SOEs and privatise them. This will be enormously controversial in China. I'm not talking about the really big ones, I'm talking about those at the modest end of the spectrum, because they want to send a message to the private entrepreneurs within the economy that there will be space in the market for them. Thirdly, I think you're also likely to see an incremental change to currency reform in China, which is going to be somewhat larger than people anticipate in terms of how wide and how fast the value of the yuan will move in relation to the US dollar. These are big calls by me, and I can easily be proven wrong on any of them. But I make them based on discussions that I've had with a bunch of people in China. My last point is this, and this is where I think Gordon again was partly right, but primarily wrong. And that is this. He said that the nature of the political system itself prevents this next phase of reform from occurring. I understand the logic of that proposition. This audience is intelligent enough to know the logic of the proposition as well. However, if you look for a very interesting recent example of a major domestic political controversy in China only a few weeks ago, involving Guangzhou 周末, the Guangzhou weekend, sorry? 南方周末, 不是广州, 南方周末, the Southern Weekend magazine or newspaper. This is a very interesting case. No one actually cleanly wins out of this case, but it was not concluded in a manner which is a crackdown on press freedom. It is a much more textured result than that. Therefore, to conclude that political repression will be the name of the day in terms of the posture of this new regime, thereby sending bad messages to economic participants, is not necessarily going to be the case. I do not believe that there is a plan to democratise China, small d or capital D. That's wrong. What you said in terms of the internal party version of democracy is the direction in which they will go. With 83 million people in the Chinese Communist Party, which would make the Chinese Communist Party the biggest country in Europe, think about it, that's a lot of people in the party. Having contestable internal elections is no small step. I think the pressure for further steps will be large if I read my Weibo account every day, as I do. Then the final point I would make is this, and that is the whole question of systemic collapse, and going back to the, shall I say, the overarching thesis which Gordon put forward. I am old enough and ugly enough to have seen so many reports about China's impending collapse for political, economic or internal division reasons over the last 30 years to now be very sceptical about the next one that I read. It is, I think, a false assumption on the part of the collective West or anyone in the United States to assume that China has got to an internal tipping point whereby it will all simply fall apart. So the Chinese leadership, in my experience, despite all the internal problems, and they are massive, are enormously intelligent, they analyse things carefully, and they take steps in a highly considered fashion. Therefore, I'm not persuaded that we're about to see any final systemic collapse. That's my overall view. I believe there are still large problems which they face, of course, but one cautionary note about what I describe as some of the economic triumphalism I heard from one of the Chinese participants up here before as well. China economy good, saving the world economy, American economy bad, full of debt, fiscal cliff yet to be resolved, going down the tube, Europe gone, basket case. That's the crude summary, but I think I got it right. Okay. You know something? We needed some objectivity about this. This is a global economy. We need every part of the economy to be performing. And objectively, having just come from Davos and spent many days in the last week with global CEOs from the world's top 100 companies, the mood in terms of the US economy recovery, in terms of order books for large firms, is trending up. Secondly, in Europe, minus Britain, it is also turning the corner. China is strong and good. We should celebrate all those three facts, not just one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. Fitting into our spectrum of perspectives on this panel. In a minute, I'm going to turn to the audience and ask you to submit questions that I will take in groups of 3 that I would like you to either direct at one of the individuals up on the panel or all of them. You decide, but then I'll choose which way to go. But before we do that, I would like to hear responses from at least two others on this panel, responses to what Mr. Rudd has just said. So first of all, Gordon, to come back on the points that, where he thinks he's still right. And let me quickly say that, there are academic economists, Daron Acemoglu at MIT, political scientists like James Robinson and Harvard, who would firmly take the side that Gordon has articulated. And in their analysis, the Chinese state, too, is incapable of reform. So I would like Gordon to come back to us on this, but then also I would like possibly Haizhou to speak to what Mr. Rudd described, I think caricatured in good fun, as Chinese triumphalism. And I wonder if I could get you to moderate some of the positions. So first Gordon, and then after that I'm going to turn to you guys.
Well, if I knew how this panel would turn out, I would not have come here today.
No.
The big issue is the political system, because that really holds the keys. Most of China's problems, apart from the demography ones, can be solved by changes in the political system. And indeed, if everyone is right on this panel except for me, and that the political system does have the capability for reform, we will see these problems settled, maybe not in short order, but clearly within a very reasonable time frame, certainly within a time frame to prevent a systemic collapse. So the real issue is, can the leaders on the Politburo Standing Committee change? And we don't really know what is in their minds, really at the end of the day. Even the number 3 ranked leader, the North Korean trained economist. What is important, though, is you have to look at the structure of the Chinese political system at this time. You know, many people, and not the Prime Minister, but some others over here, have talked about how, you know, you had a Deng Xiaoping, you had a Zhu Rongji, who were able to move and push and pull China in a much better direction. And I think the real problem here is that there is no Deng Xiaoping, and there really is no Zhu Rongji left to be able to do that. Yes, Chinese leaders know what is the right thing to do. They've been talking about all these problems for more than a half decade, some much longer than that, and they haven't been solved. And I think that's really an issue of an indication of the new Chinese political system, which is very collectivist. You have 7 people, and sometimes you have 9 people. But the point is, you have a political system that is not determined and not run by a strongman, a Deng Xiaoping or a Zhu Rongji. You have this view where you basically need almost a majority, if not a unanimous majority, in the Politburo Standing Committee to do things. And right now, that doesn't exist. And the problem is, there is the iron quadrangle in China, which is the so-called, basically, coalition of the state enterprises, the state security apparatus, the People's Liberation Army, and Communist Party conservatives. But of those groups that are opposing reform, clearly the state enterprises are the most important because they have been able to block change over the last 3 or 4 years. And the question is, have we seen anything at the 18th Party Congress that changes our view about the strength of the state enterprises? And I believe that they are probably just as strong, if not stronger, than they were before. The one other problem that can't be solved is demography. And just to give a sense, you know, people talk about Li Keqiang, who is slated to become the next premier in March. They talk about his program to push the Chinese economy forward with urbanization. Well, the question is, where is China going to get the people to put into the cities? Like my dad's hometown, you go there, a little farming village. Essentially what you have are young children under the age of about 5 or 6. You have a lot of old women and very few people in the adult range, in the adult ages. And that's because they've already gone to the cities to work in the factories. They've already been urbanized. And so essentially what you have is you don't have the pool of workers on the farms. Now, Chinese scholars disagree among themselves about whether there is this pool of workers still left in the farms to urbanize. But even those who think that there still is a pool, most of them acknowledge that not many of them want to move to the cities. And especially in the middle-aged portion of this workforce, above 35, you don't have people who want to move. So China's demographic problems provide a very big obstacle to whatever the Chinese leaders want to do. But even before we get to that, it's the question of the political system, and that's really where the disagreement in this panel lies. I believe the political system isn't going to be able to move. We will get a much better sense of this at the end of this year at the 3rd plenum, because that is traditionally the time where new leaders assert themselves. If you don't see major changes that can be implemented, announced at the 3rd plenum, then we know that we've got another 5 years of stagnation. And I believe the system can't survive another 5 years of what we've seen so far.
Thank you, Gordon. Now, just very quickly, I hope you were joking when you said you wished you hadn't come here.
Oh, I was joking. This is so much fun. I mean, why wouldn't I want to do this?
Because exactly this debate, exactly the way you're quitting yourself, is the kind of thing that at LSE we value the most. So thank you very much for this. Hi, Joe.
I would like to make 3 points quickly. First of all, I think that I pretty much agree with Prime Minister Ross's point about the external environment. I'm actually quite optimistic about the US, Europe, okay, and the other part, you know, so even Japan. Japan this year is very interesting, I think. So in that kind, I was making a logical argument, say that the external environment for China's growth will still be benign, maybe positive. I made 2 arguments. I hope I had time to make 2 arguments, but only, you know, I saw Daniel was flagging all this, so I only had time to make 1 argument, which is even if the external demand won't be strong, it would not necessarily be disaster for China because the global commodity price won't be that high and China safe enough and China can grow, rely on this external environment. If US can do better, grow at 5%, Europe can do better, grow at 8%, that's great. Okay, we know that. Okay, we all live in the same world, and I think that China welcome a stronger U.S. economy and a stronger European economy and a strong Japan economy. My second point is about the new equilibrium China is reaching. I think that China's, we're talking about the sustainable growth. China is already reaching a new equilibrium. If we look at the growth composition and the growth number and composition before 2007, China's economic growth was GDP was at 10-11%, of which about 2% come from external demand, net export growth contribution. About 3% growth come from consumption. About 5, 6, 7% come from investment growth. Okay, if we look at the current status of growth, say last year 7.7, whatever, or this year we believe will be over 8%. That 8% consists of about a 4% contribution coming from consumption and slightly higher. 4% contribution come from investment. Around 0, actually negative, a drag. Okay, last year probably minus 0.4%. This year is still a drag, minus 0.4%. Next year we hope it will be positive 0.4%, but not beyond 1% from net export. So that is the kind of new equilibrium that for the foreseeable future, probably China will stay on. Okay. Thirdly, on demographic, I already mentioned my point, but I want to take this opportunity to make it 2 tiny points. Gordon mentioned that if you look at the countryside in China, so middle-aged people, for example, over 35, probably don't stay in the village. You know how many weeks they work during the year? 15 weeks. Why they want to stay in the village? I think it's because all kind of other restrictions, hukou and the social security medical system. China would definitely need to do major reform in those areas so that the productivity of people can increase. First of all, basically, by increasing the working hours from working weeks from 15 probably towards 50. Okay. Secondly, that currently the system allowed women in China to start to retire at age 45, men at 50. What a good life! If China run out of people, those people should continue to work at age 65 and 70. Problem solved. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Rudd asked to make a quick statement before I turn to you. So,
just a quick point on, again, Gordon's point is Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, but Xi Jinping in particular because he runs the party, going to be transformational on economic reform? That's the core question of political economy which we face here. My judgment is that we need to again look at what Xi Jinping has done in his first 100 days. It's less than that. He's not been in for 100 days yet. And I intend to give a lecture on this at a university which dare not speak its name, Cambridge, on Wednesday, which is Xi Jinping's first 100 days. Number one, it has been the most intense period of public activity by a new incoming Chinese leader that I have seen in having observed Chinese politics for the last 30 to 35 years. Barely every 2 days he is either saying something strong and definitive or going somewhere in order to underline his new orientation. I mentioned before the visit to Shenzhen. That's just one of many things. On the question of, for example, cleaning up the party, he is reflecting a radically different political style. For example, when he goes to Shenzhen and when he even drives from Zhongnanhai over the 那个立秋博物馆, 什么开道车都没有, okay? Now, can you imagine Chinese leaders without a 开道车? You'd be lost if you didn't have your 开道车. But Xi Jinping, through this highly symbolic act, which all you Chinese kids here know, really offends residents in Beijing and other places where leaders shut down the streets, often for hours on end, to wait for a motorcade to pass. He's not doing that. Secondly, he's also issued edicts in terms of the abuse of official entertainment. This is very significant in terms of creating a new image for the party leadership. I think we are looking at a person in terms of his political psychology and political background who is potentially quite transformational. Normally at this stage of the cycle, you'd be making a series of speeches about how wonderful your predecessor is. I haven't heard a single speech about how wonderful his predecessor is so far. They've all been pointing to the future. The key speech is the one on national rejuvenation given at the National Historical Museum about a week or two into his leadership, where he calls for national renaissance, national rejuvenation, China's dream. I think we need to pay a lot of attention to this, and there's an underpinning couple of realities too. Here's a leader who is confident on both the left and the right. His father, Xi Jinping, has an extensive career in the Revolutionary War, an extensive career as an economic reformer. Xi Jinping himself has worn the uniform for 5 years. He was the private secretary of Geng Biao, the defense minister of China in the early 80s. And on top of that, also has himself, by being mayor or vice mayor or party secretary in a range of provincial provinces, has had to deal with the reality of making reform work on the ground. My point is, he is confident in both constituencies and doesn't have to prove anything to anybody. And what I find with this man, when I've encountered him, and many other leaders have found him the same, is that uniquely he engages in conversations about the future and about the economy without using a note, without reading the brief to you, but in a direct conversation about what must be done. The final point is, will the system allow him to do that, which I think is your ultimate macro point, Gordon? The only corrective I'd put to your overall thesis is this. This Chinese political system, in one form or another, has existed for the last 35 years, while we've seen China's economy grow from an economy the size of the Netherlands to be an economy which is second only to the United States. Now, there's something within the system which has allowed that to happen so far. When do you get to the breaking point? This is an open question in terms of the dissemination of information and the decentralisation of economic decision-making, which is intrinsic to a market economy. And when does it ultimately impact on politics? I would simply say the calibration exercise so far, with the exception of 1989, hasn't been too bad. Where they go for the future, of course, remains to be seen, but it is not prima facie that it will therefore constrain them from embracing the new reform direction. I also will make a bold prediction here, and that it will be able to be disproven as well. Sometime this year, they will formally issue a timetable for economic reforms. 一个时间表. If once you put out a 时间表, you've got a problem, because you are telling people what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. But what I know about Xi Jinping is that that's the way this guy's mind works. That is, it won't happen unless there's a timetable to do it and people are held accountable against the timeline. Now, if that doesn't happen, it all fades away because of politics, then I think we're going to have a different and more interesting conversation. By the way, my final bold prediction is that they will now begin to make amendments of a broader nature to the one-child policy for the future. That doesn't deal with the demographic problem today at all, but I think they recognise the problem that they've inherited through policies adopted in the past.
Thank you. Now, I was hoping we'd have more time for questions, but I couldn't let the panel like this get away without pressing them more. So now if I can turn to the gentleman here first in the middle. Are there microphones that are coming around? Yes, on your right. And then over there.
Thank you very much. My question is to Kevin. My name is Feng Xue. I'm a current student from LSE and also a journalist working for China Business News. My question is, as Australia is becoming more economically Chinese, but still politically Anglo-Saxon, so how Australia strike a balance in the context of US refocusing in the Pacific Asia? The second question is, what's your message you want to send to the Xi Jinping administration in terms of its political reform and the economic policy, or your hopes, your suggestions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If we could take them in groups of 3, just give everyone a chance. The woman in blue. Over here, the woman in blue.
Yeah, I want to ask that the past 4 or 5 years have witnessed that a lot of mergers and acquisitions has been done to the SOEs, especially those small or even middle-sized ones, and the government has been left those private firms to die within those financial crises. So, and they claimed it was a fair sacrifice for sustainable growth in the long run. Do you agree with that?
Okay, thank you. We'll record that. And then someone from here. The gentleman with the, sorry, in back. The gentleman in the black jumper, black sweater with the blue collar.
Well, firstly, happy Australia Day to Mr. Rudd. And then I wanted to ask a question about local government and central government discrepancies. I think one of the major problems is the central government has a lot of enlightened people who want to make a lot of reforms, but the incentive structure of local government party secretaries like Bo Xilai, Zhang Gaoli, Wang Yang is to pump debt and get a lot of growth happening and then try to get in the PBSC. And Bo Xilai got purged, and Zhang Gaoli, did the same thing to Tianjin. They've got over 100% GDP debt, and yet he's sitting on the 7-member PBSC. Just wondering some comments on that, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rudd, if I could ask you to invite you to take the question about which way Australia is leaning.
I think the question is this is a question about Australia. We're politically Anglo-Saxon. Sorry, can't sort of change that really. 我就是洋人，你可以看一下。And economically, we're in China's camp. This is a 19th and 20th century question about a 21st century reality. These binaries don't exist anymore. There's one reason for it. How many of you folks have been to Australia? Throw your hands up. Okay. Walk down the street of Sydney and Melbourne, people are from everywhere. When I walk down the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, after English, what I hear is Chinese spoken, actually, most in the streets. There are nearly 1 million Chinese in Australia today out of a population of 23 million people. And by the way, more than half of our annual immigration intake is now from Asia. And we take in a lot of people each year, 200,000 plus. In fact, by some measures, 300,000 plus. And so for us, this is not a question of alternatives. We are who we are. We treasure our values because we come from a Western civilization. We believe in the rule of law. We're a parliamentary democracy. We also hold these values to be universal, which partly answers your second question as well. The political economy question which you ask about my advice to the Chinese government, my response to that is, one, I never give other politicians public advice. Unless I'm competing against them in my own democracy, okay? So how China evolves its political system is a matter for the Chinese. I have said my belief is that democratic values are universal. How China evolves its system over time is a matter for it. The China I went to live in 1984, interesting year if you're a student of Orwell, was one which was frankly about 2 out of 10 on the freedom scale. The China that my daughter and son-in-law and Chinese-Australian granddaughter live in today is about 6 out of 10 on the freedom scale, in terms of you kids all being here, choosing your own careers, reading stuff in the newspapers which constantly counters the party line, and a social media which is totally out of control. And these things, I think, point in a reasonably positive direction. The key question in terms of advice to the Chinese leadership is how should China use its national wealth and power to participate in the global and regional rules-based order for the future? That, I think, is the apposite question for the world.
Thank you. Okay, Pierre and Chen Guan, could I ask the two of you to divide between yourselves the question on M&A and local and provincial governments?
Okay. I was going to say something on both, but I'll limit myself to the third question. I believe that the person who raised that question puts his finger at a fundamental issue. The lack of synchronization of central government and local government interests and incentives is at the roots of many of the economic and social problems and the local government debt problems. You correctly identified that. I think if I had a role in the Chinese government, I would focus on fiscal reforms such as to minimize these conflicts of interest between the center. You've seen it very strongly in the effort since 2010 to control the real estate bubble. The bubble itself was the result, in my opinion, to a large extent of the excessive credit creation in from late 2008 through the first few months of 2010. Much of that money ended up for speculative purposes, land values, real estate values. When the stimulus program in response to the international financial crisis started at the end of 2008, there was a remarkable harmony of interests between local governments and the central government. They all wanted to get growth going again and people re-employed again. But that harmony of interest began to break down when the credit expansion, especially in 2009, was excessive and stimulated speculation in land values, real estate, which was precisely what many local governments needed for their local revenues. So when Beijing wanted to kill the bubble, they had trouble getting the local governments to play along, because the local governments often had an interest in stimulating the bubble for local revenue purposes. So I totally agree with you. It's a fundamental issue. I would make that my priority if I were in the Ministry of Finance or in the planning office in China.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree totally that these two issues are very fundamental, and also touch one issue is about the political and reform issue. SOE, reform, I think I believe it's the most difficult part. So the Xi Jinping, for example, the key question I want to ask is how to overcome the vast interest, of this SOE group. 这个 SOE 就是国进民退，就是呢 in the past 5 years we are experiencing these state-owned sectors are taking over, private sector are retreating. Increasingly they are dominant in all sectors with all this monopoly power, all the wealth accumulated to this a group of people, a small group of people, and also reduce the efficiency of the economy. How to fight back, liberalize the economy, allow private sector to enter these sectors and to also, prosper. I think that's the key political test, whether the new leadership can overcome this vested interest. That's actually, to me, even though I'm thinking the next 5 years, it's probably economically should be okay, but this is the question I don't know. Really. And also the local government, this question asked also relate to the governance structure, the political system. All the local leaders, because they can be promoted if they have achieved a high growth rate. But the consequences, the debt issues, it probably will be, forgotten if they already got promoted in future. So that's how to evaluate the bureaucrats and how to, the whole promotion system. All this is to do with, the political system reform.
Thank you. Another round of questions. So, okay, in back, the gentleman who was next to the one who asked the last question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering, a lot of talk here has been given to economics, GDP growth and the like, and this is all well and good. But I mean, very little lip service has been paid to anything arising about the environment. There is a very big concern, associated with land economy in terms of rural development, in terms of constraining farmland and water shortage. And as much as, it is
Sorry, if you could get to your question.
Well, what are your views on the environment?
Okay.
In general.
Thank you. Okay. From gentleman in the back, way in the back, up against the wall.
Thank you very much. I was wondering whether you could comment more on the issues of escaping the middle income trap, rising up the value chain and increasing total factor productivity. Professor Huang has already mentioned a bit about the hukou reform, but I think, well, I would be grateful if you can comment more on labor issues and the like.
Okay, thank you. And then the woman with the grayish fashionable scarf. Over here, just over here.
Thank you, Professor. I got this question, which is not about Chinese economy, actually, because nowadays, I know some people think more money does not mean more happiness. And this is a question that arises in China, especially in the middle classes. And also it refers to the demographic problem as well, because due to the one-child policy, nowadays there's a very obvious situation that some of the child need to feed both their families, like they need to buy house for their own parents and also for their wives or husbands' family. So I think this is a very serious problem in China. What's your opinion about this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got 3 interesting, very large questions. What I'd like to do now is to run through the panel. They get to choose which question they want to address. So if I could begin on that end and then work up here. Pierre, if I could get you to pick up on any one of these questions. Anyone?
I just came back from Beijing.
Okay. So that was your, that was it. Excellent. Very good. Very good. Hi, Joe.
I would like to comment on the middle income trap issue. I think it's related to demographic and related to China's urbanization, and it related to many issues. You know that farmers in China live very hard life. We know that. Farmers start to get a subsidy. I think they deserve it. Okay, there's no question about that. However, if you have a population of 50% who are not that rich, live in the urban area to subsidize the other 50%, you are in a middle income trap. There's no way out. Okay, so only way going forward is continue to push for urbanization, diminishing the denominator, so that in the end that you have 70% subsidize 30%. In the end, 95% subsidize 5%. Okay. China's country size is more or less the same as the United States. China's arable land is smaller than the United States. The difference is the US West Coast and China's Himalaya mountain. Okay? If China in the end leaves 5% of the population to take care of the land, also assuming 30 years from now, because of the aging issue, which is happening, China's population size shrink to 1.2 billion. 5% of that 1.2 billion is basically huge number. Relative to US 5% population is 4 times, okay? More than enough to take care of the land. That means over the next 30 years or so, China needs to move 45% of the population out of the country to the urban area. That is the source of growth for investment, and it's created demand for investment, and it will provide source for consumption growth, and that will address many, many issues. If China does that right, there will be no income trap for China.
Thank you. Thank you. So the way out of the middle income trap. Thank you very much. Chen Guang, can I ask you to?
Yeah, maybe I touch upon the environmental issue. Even though Beijing situation is very bad, but in the past few years, when I went to some other part of the country, I feel the environmental situation has improved tremendously. I think that's come with the development of the property sector. The property, many people own property. And then in many cities, they are trying to clean the rivers. Where in the past, it's before China, the property reform and the manufacturing, factory investment to produce is the most important thing. To pollute the rivers, it's a matter of fact. But now we are seeing this river has been cleaned because the revaluation of the property around these rivers are become so much more important than the manufacturing. So I think it's a natural process that are improving in a way that in China the word is 常理奢侈礼节. 你是现在 you will become richer, and then you start to pay attention to environmental issues. And that's also, so many protests in China these days to protect, regarding these environmental issues. So I think that's actually, it starts to show that it's becoming more and more important issues and can be solved with the development of the economy.
Thank you. Gordon.
I find the happiness question to be, in some ways, the most significant, because it's something that we not only just discussed in this panel, but also through other panels today. And it highlights a fundamental change in the Chinese society. The China today, as the Prime Minister said, is so very different from the society of 5-10 years ago. And essentially what we have is people who have gotten more. The economic development has not only made them richer, but it's changed their outlook, where people didn't talk about happiness when my dad left China, but they do talk about that now because of the changes in society. The question is going to be whether the political system responds to that, and that is the overarching question of systemic risk that we didn't talk about today.
Thank you. Mr. Rudd.
On the, just a word on the environment. I think this has moved from the margins to the centre of the Chinese policy debate within the country. And this is not because China has suddenly discovered its own sense of global environmental responsibilities through climate change. The Chinese government has concluded that failure to act on the environment, including on climate change, could actually strangle and kill the growth model itself. And the physical manifestation of that in terms of the water table in the North China Plain through to what's happening in the Himalayas and in other manifestations of climate change are the cause now of not just real concern within China, but unless you can produce something by way of economic policy which systemically integrates the concepts of 持续性发展, sustainable development, it does not get a pijuan. The second point is this. The Huanbaoju in the past, the Environmental Protection Agency, has not been powerful enough. It actually is a question of different levels of government as well. I know the Huanbaoju people pretty well. The Huanbaoju will put out a statement saying we're going to close 86 coal-fired power stations around the country. This then goes down to the provincial and sub-provincial level, and 上有政策,下有对策, 是不是? And they then, above they have policies and below they have counter-policies. What is required if China is going to give effect to genuine sustainable development policies is an EPA with teeth, power and an ability to override. The final question I'll touch on again is the good question that was posed about values. I think I've caught it more broadly, happiness and the rest. Okay, Chinese students here, which of you is happy? Put your hands up. Okay. Which of you is really happy? Who's not happy? Okay. Can I just say, thank you very much. Okay. I won't ask you what you're not happy about, but these are perfectly valid questions in any 21st century society for all generations of people. And as someone who's visited China hundreds of times, not hundreds of times, but more than 100 times over the years, all of the kids that I know in China are talking about these things. It's complex, it's interfaced with realities. You've spoken about the baseline social reality, which comes out as a direct consequence of the one-child policy. There are other questions of values as well. Marxism as an effective ideology in China is dead. Okay? 马克思已经去看马克思，对不对？ And so in the absence of Marxism, what replaces the ideational, some would say ideological, I would call it ideational vacuum. The Catholic Church in China is now the 4th largest Catholic community in the world. There is something happening on the religious front there, but the values debate in China is valid, normal, and it's being expressed in the explosion in the social media as well. My only word of encouragement is that this is a values debate not just contained within the Chinese world, it's a values debate being held now in 21st century societies and young people in particular across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, I know that we have lots of questions still, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of this afternoon's session. Before I invite the students, the organizers to come up and make an announcement about what happens next, I just want to say that I can honestly say I've never enjoyed a panel as much as I have